Fort St. Elmo fell on the 23rd of June, 1565, after a siege that had lasted almost a month. The Ottomans had expected the tiny star-shaped fort to hold out for perhaps 4 or 5 days. Instead, its defenders, a garrison of knights and soldiers numbering little more than a few hundred, had fought for every stone and every hour, extracting a blood price that stunned the Ottoman command. Estimates vary, but the attackers may have lost as many as 6,000 men taking a fortification barely larger than a city block. Among the dead was Dragut, the most feared corsair in the Mediterranean, killed by a splinter from a cannonball strike during the final days of the bombardment. When Mustafa Pasha, the Ottoman land commander, walked through the ruins and saw the extent of his losses, he is said to have looked across the Grand Harbour toward the far larger fortifications of Birgu and Senglea and asked what the parent would cost if the child had cost so dear. It was a fair question. Fort St. Elmo had been a minor outwork, a preliminary obstacle. The real objective had always been the twin peninsulas of Birgu and Senglea, which together formed the heart of the Knights' defences on Malta. These were larger, more heavily fortified, and defended by the bulk of the remaining garrison under Grand Master La Valette himself. And yet for all the destruction, the Ottoman position remained formidable. Mustafa still commanded tens of thousands of soldiers, and his siege guns, some of the largest in the world, were already being repositioned to bear on the new targets. The fleet, now safely anchored in Harbour thanks to St. Elmo's capture, secured his supply lines. On paper, the mathematics of the siege still overwhelmingly favoured the attackers. But Fort St. Elmo had changed something less tangible than numbers. The defenders behind the walls of Birgu and Senglea had watched their comrades die across the harbour, and they had seen what that death had cost the enemy. They knew now that Ottoman soldiers could be stopped, could be bled, could be made to pay for every yard of ground. La Valette had spent those lives deliberately, buying the one commodity he needed above all else: time. Time for his messengers to reach Sicily, time for the Viceroy Don Garcia de Toledo to assemble a relief force, time for the summer campaigning season to shorten. Whether that relief would ever come remained an open question. La Valette had been sending urgent appeals for months, and the responses had been evasive. The fate of Malta now hinged on 2 parallel struggles: the physical battle on the walls, where a dwindling garrison of perhaps 6,000 would face repeated mass assaults through the brutal heat of a Mediterranean summer, and the political battle in distant courts, where caution and calculation threatened to leave the island to its fate. Both of those struggles were about to reach their crisis. Part 1. The Noose tightens. The geography of the Grand Harbour dictated everything about how the next phase of the siege would unfold. Birgu and Senglea were 2 narrow peninsulas that jutted out into the harbour like a pair of fingers, running roughly parallel to each other with a creek of water between them. At the tip of Birgu sat Fort St. Angelo, the oldest and strongest fortification on Malta, which served as the Knights' headquarters. Senglea was defended by the newer Fort St. Michael at its tip and along its landward walls. Both peninsulas were narrow enough that their fortifications could concentrate defenders along relatively short frontages, but they were also overlooked by higher ground on almost every side, which gave the Ottoman gunners a punishing advantage. Between the 2 peninsulas, La Valette had ordered a wooden palisade and a chain stretched across the water. This barrier served 2 purposes. It prevented Ottoman boats from sailing into the creek and attacking the vulnerable inner flanks of both peninsulas, and it allowed the defenders to shuttle reinforcements and wounded between Birgu and Senglea by boat, maintaining a degree of flexibility that their small numbers desperately required. Lose that connection, and each peninsula would be fighting alone. The landward approach to Birgu was defended by a series of walls and bastions, the most important of which was the Post of Castile, a section of curtain wall that faced south toward the high ground the Ottomans now occupied. This would become the most fought-over piece of masonry on the island. Senglea's landward defences were similarly anchored on walls and bastions facing the same southern high ground, but Senglea also had water on its western side, which meant it could be attacked from the sea as well as from the land. La Valette understood all of this. He had spent the weeks before the siege and the month of St. Elmo's agony strengthening every position he could, But he also knew that his walls were not truly first-rate fortifications by the standards of the age. They were adequate, reinforced where possible, but they would not withstand prolonged bombardment from the kind of heavy guns the Ottomans were now dragging into position. The defense of Birgu and Senglea would depend less on stone and more on the willingness of the people behind those stones to fight. With Dragut dead and the fleet securely anchored, Mustafa Pasha set about reorganizing his forces for the main assault. The massive siege cannon that had battered Fort St. Elmo were hauled to new positions on the heights of Santa Margherita, which overlooked Birgu from the south, and on the Corradino Heights, which commanded Senglea. From these elevated positions, the Ottoman gunners could fire almost directly down into the streets and fortifications of both peninsulas. It was a devastating advantage. The defenders could repair walls at night, but each morning the guns would open up again and reduce hours of labor to rubble in minutes. Mustafa planned to attack both peninsulas simultaneously, stretching the small garrison to its breaking point. If the defenders concentrated on holding Birgu, Senglea might fall. If they rushed to save Senglea, the walls of Birgu might be stormed. With roughly 6,000 defenders, including soldiers, knights, and armed Maltese civilians, against an Ottoman force that still numbered in the tens of thousands despite the losses at St. Elmo, Mustafa had every reason to believe that sheer weight of numbers would eventually tell. He also had his fleet, which gave him the option of attacking Senglea from the water, opening yet another front that the defenders would have to cover. The first major Ottoman move against the peninsulas came by sea, and it targeted Senglea. The approach was bold and logistically impressive. The Grand Harbour's entrance was partially controlled by Fort St. Angelo's guns, making a direct naval assault into the harbour risky. So the Ottomans did what they had done at other sieges. They moved boats overland. Sailors and soldiers hauled a number of small vessels across the base of the Shibara's peninsula from Marsamshed Harbour, where the fleet was anchored, and launched them into the Grand Harbour on the far side, bypassing the harbour entrance entirely. From there, these boats could strike at Senglea's western shore, the side that faced open water rather than the creek. It was a well-conceived plan, but La Valette had anticipated it. He'd ordered a concealed gun battery built at the waterline on the tip of Senglea, positioned low and hidden so that it would not be spotted from the heights above. When the Ottoman boats came rowing towards Senglea's shore, packed with soldiers ready to scale the walls from the sea, this battery opened fire at close range. The effect was devastating. Cannonballs tore through the crowded boats, smashing timber and men alike. The waterborne assault collapsed in confusion, with the surviving boats pulling back out of range. The Ottoman dead floated in the harbour. It was a sharp, costly failure, and it demonstrated that La Valette, for all his disadvantages, was a commander who thought several moves ahead. But Mustafa Pasha was not a man to be deterred by a single setback. Through the end of June and into July, the bombardment of both peninsulas continued without pause, and Ottoman engineers pushed their trenches closer to the walls. The conditions inside the fortifications deteriorated steadily. Buildings were reduced to heaps of broken stone. The summer heat was intense, water was rationed, and the garrison was already taking casualties from the constant artillery fire before any major assault had even been launched. The wounded filled every available space, and the men on the walls were sleeping, when they could sleep at all, within yards of the guns. On the 15th of July, Mustafa launched the first great coordinated assault on Senglea. This was a full-scale effort to overwhelm Fort St. Michael and the landward walls of Senglea with massed infantry, supported by simultaneous pressure on Birgu to prevent La Valette from sending reinforcements across the creek. The attack came in waves. Ottoman infantry charged across the open ground toward Senglea's southern walls, while boats again attempted to land troops on the western shore. The fighting was ferocious. Ottoman soldiers reached the walls, planted ladders and began to climb. In several places they gained footholds on the ramparts. The defenders fought them with swords, pikes, stones, boiling water, and the incendiary weapons that had proved so effective at Fort St. Elmo. The fighting surged back and forth along the war line, with small groups of Ottoman soldiers breaching the defences, only to be cut down in desperate counterattacks. Then the walls were breached. Ottoman troops poured through a gap in Senglea's defences and pushed into the streets beyond. For a moment, it appeared that the peninsula might fall. The defenders were being driven back, and the sheer number of attackers flooding through the breach threatened to overwhelm the remaining resistance. If Senglea fell, Birgu's western flank would be completely exposed, and the entire defensive position on the Grand Harbour would begin to unravel. What happened next came from the opposite end of the island. Mdina, the old walled capital in the centre of Malta, had been left with only a skeleton garrison, mostly Maltese militia and a small force of cavalry under the command of a knight named Mesquita. Mdina was too far from the harbour to contribute directly to the defence of Birgu and Senglea, but Mesquita had been watching for an opportunity. When he saw the bulk of the Ottoman army committed to the assault on Senglea, he led his small cavalry force out of Mdina's gates and struck at the Ottoman rear camp. The raiders hit the camp hard, killing those they found and setting fires. The effect on the main assault was immediate and disproportionate. Word reached the Ottoman troops at the walls that their camp was under attack, and a ripple of uncertainty ran through the assault force. Soldiers who moments before had been pushing through the breach in Senglea's walls began to hesitate. Commanders pulled men back to deal with the threat to their rear. The momentum of the assault broke. The defenders of Senglea seized the moment. They counterattacked into the breach, driving back the Ottoman troops who had entered the peninsula and retaking the damaged walls. The fighting was savage and close-quartered, but with the Ottoman assault losing its cohesion, the defenders were able to stabilize the line. By the time the sun set, the Ottomans had withdrawn, leaving the ground in front of Senglea's walls thick with their dead. Mesquita's cavalry sortie from Mdina had been a small action in purely military terms, involving perhaps a few hundred horsemen at most. But its timing had been critical. It struck at the moment of maximum Ottoman commitment, when every available soldier was focused on the breach, and it introduced just enough doubt and disorder to tip the balance at the decisive point. Whether Senglea would have fallen without the sortie is impossible to say, but the defenders themselves had been on the verge of being overwhelmed when the pressure suddenly eased. The 15th of July was a turning point, though not a decisive one. Senglea had held, but only barely. The walls were badly damaged, the garrison had taken serious casualties, and Mustafa Pasha still had the men and the guns to try again. The assault had shown the Ottomans exactly how thin the defence was, and it had shown the defenders how close they were to breaking. Both sides understood that the next great assault might well produce a different result. La Valette sent another message to Sicily that night, carried by a swimmer who slipped into the dark water of the harbour. The message was the same one he had been sending for weeks: "Send help, or Malta will fall." Part 2. The Walls of Birgu. The failure of the July 15th assault did not bring any respite for the defenders. If anything, the pace of the bombardment increased. Mustafa Pasha, stung by the repulse at Senglea but far from defeated, ordered his gunners to concentrate their fire on the weakest sections of both peninsula's walls. Through the second half of July and into August, the Ottoman batteries on the Santa Margherita and Corradino heights fired almost continuously, pausing only when the guns needed to cool or when powder supplies had to be brought forward. The effect on the fortifications was relentless and cumulative. Walls that had been patched overnight were smashed again by morning. Bastions that had been solid stone at the start of the siege were now little more than slopes of loose rubble held together by earth and sandbags. The conditions inside Birgu and Senglea became almost unendurable. Every building within range of the Ottoman guns, which meant nearly every building on both peninsulas, had been damaged or destroyed. The streets were choked with broken masonry. Dust from the constant bombardment hung in the air and mixed with the heat of the Mediterranean summer to create a suffocating atmosphere. Water was strictly rationed. Food was adequate for now, as La Valette had stockpiled supplies before the siege, but the diet was monotonous and the effort of constant labour and fighting left everyone perpetually exhausted. The garrison was shrinking. Every day the artillery fire killed or maimed defenders on the walls, and the wounded were filling the hospital of the Order and every other available building. The Knights Hospitaller had originally been founded as a medical order, and their hospital was one of the finest in Europe, but it was now overwhelmed. Surgeons worked without rest, amputating shattered limbs and treating burns, but many of the wounded would never return to the walls. The effective fighting strength of the garrison, already badly outnumbered at the start of the siege, was declining week by week. What made the defense possible, beyond the fortifications and the fighting skill of the knights, was the participation of the Maltese civilian population. This was their island, their homes, and their families, and they fought for them with a ferocity that matched anything the professional soldiers could offer. Maltese men, women, and children all contributed to the defense. Men who had been farmers and fishermen weeks before now stood on the walls alongside knights and professional soldiers, wielding whatever weapons were available. Women carried stones up to the ramparts, prepared boiling water and oil to pour on attackers, and tended the wounded. Children ran messages and carried supplies through the shattered streets. The siege of Malta was not solely a battle between the Knights Hospitaller and the Ottoman Empire. It was a fight waged by an entire population. La Valette himself was central to the defense in a way that went beyond strategy and command decisions. At 71 years old, he was a constant presence on the walls, particularly at the most dangerous points. He had made a deliberate decision not to shelter in Fort St. Angelo, the strongest position on Birgu and the obvious place for a commander to direct operations from relative safety. Instead, he stayed forward, visible to both his own men and to the enemy. His reasoning was practical as much as symbolic. He knew that morale was the single most important factor in the defense, and that if the garrison saw their Grand Master sharing their danger, they would be far less likely to waver. During one of the Ottoman assaults on the walls, La Valette personally led a counterattack to retake a breached section of the fortifications. In the fighting, he was struck in the leg by fragments from a grenade. His officers urged him to withdraw and have the wound treated. He refused, continuing to direct the defense from the breach until the attack was repulsed. Only then did he allow the surgeons to attend to him, and he was back on the walls within hours. The wound troubled him for the rest of the siege, but he never used it as a reason to retire to a safer position. His presence in the front line was calculated to send a message that he considered unmistakable. There would be no retreat, no negotiation, and no surrender. Beneath the walls, a different and perhaps even more terrifying battle was being fought. Ottoman engineers, experienced in siege warfare from decades of campaigns across Europe and the Middle East, began digging tunnels toward the foundations of Birgu's fortifications. The objective was to excavate chambers beneath the walls, pack them with gunpowder, and detonate them, bringing down entire sections of the defenses in a single catastrophic explosion. Mining was one of the most effective siege techniques of the period, and the Ottomans were skilled practitioners. The defenders could hear them. The sound of picks and shovels working through rock carried through the ground, a dull, rhythmic scraping that the sentries on the walls learned to dread. La Valette ordered countermining operations, sending his own diggers out to intercept the Ottoman tunnels before they could reach the walls. This subterranean war was fought in cramped, dark passages, barely large enough for a man to crouch in, with a constant fear that the enemy might break through into your tunnel at any moment, or that the ground above might collapse and bury you alive. When the counterminers located an Ottoman tunnel, the result was either a desperate underground fight in near-total darkness, or a race to set charges and collapse the enemy tunnel before it could be completed. On several occasions, the Ottomans successfully detonated their mines, bringing down sections of Birgu's walls in eruptions of earth and stone that killed defenders on the ramparts above. Each time, La Valette had to rush men to the breach before Ottoman infantry could exploit the gap. Each time, the defenders rebuilt what they could and prepared to fight over the rubble. On at least one occasion, the defenders managed to dig into a completed Ottoman mine chamber before it could be detonated, removing the powder charges and collapsing the tunnel. On another, they flooded an Ottoman tunnel by diverting water into their own countermine. The mining war was an exhausting, nerve-shredding struggle that consumed manpower and energy the defenders could barely spare, but it was essential. If the Ottomans had been able to mine freely and without opposition, the walls of Birgu would have come down far sooner than they did. By the beginning of August, both sides were being ground down. The Ottomans had suffered thousands of additional casualties in the assaults and bombardments since St. Elmo's fall, and disease was beginning to spread through their camp. Dysentery, the perennial killer of armies in the field, was taking a steady toll. The summer heat was as punishing for the besiegers as for the besieged, and the Ottoman soldiers had been fighting or laboring in the trenches for nearly 3 months. Mustafa Pasha needed a breakthrough, and he needed it soon. On the 7th of August, he ordered the largest and most determined assault yet. This was to be an all-out effort against multiple points simultaneously, designed to overwhelm the defenders by attacking everywhere at once. The primary objective was Birgu, and the main thrust was directed at the post of Castile, the section of the landward wall that had been most heavily bombarded and was now little more than a mound of rubble. But simultaneous attacks were launched against Senglea's walls as well, forcing La Valette to defend everywhere at once with a garrison that was now dangerously thin. The attack began at dawn with a final concentrated bombardment, and then the Ottoman infantry advanced. At the post of Castile, where the wall had been reduced to a rough slope of broken stone, the fighting was hand-to-hand almost from the start. There was no wall to scale, no clear rampart to defend. Attackers and defenders fought over a heap of debris, clambering up loose rubble while swinging swords, thrusting pikes and hurling stones. The Ottomans came in waves, each fresh line of soldiers climbing over the bodies of those who had fallen before them. The defenders, many of them wounded from previous engagements, fought with the desperation of men who knew that there was nothing behind them. The assault went on for hours. At several points, Ottoman soldiers gained the top of the rubble and pushed into the streets beyond, only to be met by counterattacks led by knights who had been held in reserve for exactly this moment. La Valette directed the defense, shifting his dwindling reserves from one crisis point to another as reports came in from along the line. The fighting at Senglea was nearly as fierce, with another breach in the walls there threatening to crack open the entire position. By the afternoon, the assault had spent itself. The Ottoman infantry, exhausted and having taken terrible casualties, pulled back from the walls. The post of Castile had held, though the defenders who had held it were barely recognizable as a fighting force. Senglea, too, had survived, its walls battered but unbroken in any decisive way. The garrison that night was at its lowest ebb. The knights and soldiers who remained on their feet were functioning on almost no sleep, many were carrying untreated wounds, and everyone understood the arithmetic. Each assault cost the Ottomans more men in absolute terms, but the defenders could not replace their losses at all. Every knight or soldier or Maltese fighter who fell on the walls was gone permanently. The Ottomans, despite their losses, still had reserves to draw on. La Valette's nightly messages to Sicily continued. The content did not change. Send the relief force, or there will be no one left to relieve. Part 3. The Relief. The question of relief had hung over the siege from its very first days. La Valette had known from the beginning that Malta's tiny garrison could not defeat the Ottoman army outright. The best he could hope for was to hold long enough for a relief force to arrive from Christian Europe, and in practice that meant from Sicily, the nearest major base. The Viceroy of Sicily, Don Garcia de Toledo, commanded the naval and military resources of the Spanish crown in the central Mediterranean. He had the ships and the soldiers to raise the siege. The question was whether he would send them, and when. Don Garcia was not an indecisive man by nature, but he was operating under enormous constraints. His fleet and his army belonged to Philip II of Spain, and Philip's strategic priorities extended far beyond Malta. Spain was fighting wars and managing commitments across half of Europe and the Mediterranean, and the loss of a major fleet in a failed relief operation would have consequences that reached far beyond one besieged island. Don Garcia also had imperfect intelligence about conditions on Malta. He knew the Ottomans had landed in force, but the exact state of the defences, the strength of the remaining garrison, and the condition of the Ottoman army were all difficult to assess from across 100 miles of open sea. There was also a genuine strategic dilemma. If Don Garcia sailed too early with an insufficient force and was defeated at sea or on the beaches, there would be no second attempt. If he waited too long, there would be nothing left to relieve. Threading that needle required a degree of judgment that no amount of intelligence could fully inform, and Don Garcia erred consistently on the side of caution. From La Valette's perspective, besieged and watching his garrison bleed out week by week, this caution looked indistinguishable from abandonment. La Valette's messages to Sicily grew increasingly blunt as the summer wore on. Swimmers carried dispatches across the harbour at night and then by boat to Sicily, a dangerous journey that not all of them survived. The messages detailed the state of the walls, the casualties, and the dwindling supplies of gunpowder and men. They made clear that the garrison was fighting at the limits of endurance, and that every week of delay reduced the chances that there would be a functioning defense when relief finally arrived. Don Garcia replied with assurances and promises, but the fleet did not sail. Meanwhile, the Ottoman army was suffering its own crisis, though it was less visible from behind the walls of Birgu. By mid-August, Mustafa Pasha's forces had been in the field for over 3 months. The losses at Fort St. Elmo, the failed assaults on Senglea, and the repeated attacks on Birgu had cost the army thousands of dead and many more thousands of wounded. Disease had become a serious problem. Dysentery, infections from wounds, and the general toll of prolonged campaigning in summer heat were eroding the army's strength in ways that could not be offset by willpower alone. The morale of the Ottoman soldiers, who had been told at the start of the campaign that Malta would fall quickly, was deteriorating. They had watched wave after wave of assaults break against walls defended by a garrison that by all logic should have been overwhelmed weeks ago. The Janissaries, the elite infantry who formed the core of the assault force, had taken particularly heavy casualties and were increasingly reluctant to throw themselves at breaches that had already consumed so many of their comrades. Mustafa Pasha continued to order attacks through the second half of August, but each one was weaker in execution than the last. An assault on the 18th of August was beaten back with relative speed, and subsequent efforts showed the same pattern of diminishing intensity. Mustafa was also watching the calendar. The Mediterranean sailing season had a hard limit. Autumn storms made naval operations increasingly dangerous from late September onward, and the Ottoman fleet could not afford to be caught in open water or pinned against a hostile shore by bad weather. Every day that passed without a decisive breakthrough brought Mustafa closer to the point where he would have to withdraw regardless of the military situation, simply to preserve his fleet and the remnants of his army for the voyage home. The siege was becoming a race against time for both sides, with La Valette waiting for Don Garcia and Mustafa running out of season. The first tangible sign that help was coming arrived in late August. A small force of roughly 600 to 700 volunteers, mainly Spanish and Italian soldiers, and a number of knights who had been overseas when the siege began, managed to reach Malta by sea and slip into Birgu under cover of darkness. This force was known as the Piccolo Soccorso, the little relief, and in purely numerical terms it was barely significant. 600 or 700 men would not shift the balance of a siege involving tens of thousands. But the psychological impact was enormous, and it cut in both directions. Inside the walls, the arrival of fresh troops, men who were unwounded and rested and who had chosen to come, sent a surge of energy through the exhausted garrison. It meant that they had not been forgotten, that ships could reach them, and that a larger force might follow. For the Ottomans, the Piccolo Soccorso carried a different message. If a small force could reach Malta, a large one could too. The arrival of fresh defenders, however few, suggested that Don Garcia was preparing to move in strength and that the window for taking the island was closing. Mustafa Pasha pressed on with further assaults in the final days of August and the first days of September, but the attacks lacked the overwhelming force of the earlier efforts. The Ottoman army was tired, sick, and increasingly demoralized. The defenders, reinforced and with renewed hope, fought with a tenacity that the attackers could no longer match. The siege had reached a stalemate that favored the defenders, because every day of stalemate was a day closer to the end of the campaigning season. On the 7th of September 1565, Don Garcia de Toledo finally landed the main relief force on the northern coast of Malta, at Melihar Bay. The force numbered roughly 9,000 men, a mix of Spanish, Sicilian, and Italian troops, along with contingents of knights. It was not a large army, but it was fresh, well-equipped, and arriving against an enemy that had been in the field for nearly 4 months. Mustafa Pasha's reaction to the landing revealed the state of his army. He initially ordered a general embarkation, pulling his remaining troops off the island and onto the ships. The siege was over, and he knew it. But then, either through pride or through a genuine belief that he could defeat the relief force before it linked up with the garrison, he changed his mind. He ordered his soldiers back ashore for one final engagement. It was a mistake. The Ottoman troops who landed again were the same exhausted, disease-weakened men who had been failing to take the walls of Birgu and Senglea for weeks. The relief force they now faced was composed of fresh soldiers who had not endured months of siege warfare. The resulting battle, fought in the open ground of the island's interior, was brief and one-sided. The Spanish and Sicilian troops advanced aggressively, and the Ottoman forces, after a limited resistance, broke and retreated to the coast. Mustafa managed to re-embark the bulk of his surviving army, but the withdrawal was hurried and disorderly. The Ottoman fleet sailed away from Malta in the second week of September, ending a siege that had lasted nearly 4 months. The cost of the siege was staggering on both sides. The Ottoman Empire had committed one of the largest expeditionary forces of the 16th century to the capture of Malta and had failed completely. Their losses are difficult to pin down precisely, but most estimates place the dead at somewhere above 20,000, with many more wounded or incapacitated by disease. Among the dead were some of the finest soldiers in the Ottoman military, including large numbers of janissaries and experienced corsairs. The defenders had paid their own terrible price. Of the roughly 6,000 who had manned the walls at the start of the siege, perhaps half were dead or too badly wounded to fight by the end. The Maltese civilian population had suffered enormously, with thousands killed in the bombardments and fighting. Birgu and Senglea were barely recognizable. The fortifications that had held against months of bombardment were shattered. Entire streets had ceased to exist. The hospital was overflowing, and the dead had been buried wherever space could be found. La Valette survived. In the weeks after the Ottoman withdrawal, as the immediate crisis gave way to the slower work of burying the dead and tending the wounded, he turned his attention to the future. The siege had exposed the fundamental vulnerability of the existing defences. Birgu and Senglea had held, but they had been overlooked by the heights that the Ottomans had used to such devastating effect. If the Ottomans returned, and there was no guarantee they would not, the same heights would give them the same advantages. La Valette's solution was to build a new fortified city on the Shibara's peninsula itself, the high ground where Fort St. Elmo stood and where so many had died on both sides. A city built there would command the harbours on either side and deny any future attacker the elevated gun positions that had made the 1565 siege so punishing. The first stone was laid in March of 1566, and the city was named Valletta, after the man who had held Malta when it seemed certain to fall. La Valette did not see it completed. He died in August of 1568, 3 years after the siege, and was buried in the city that bore his name. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.